I've never known how to begin talking about death. I'm not sure how to approach it with the gravity it deserves or the surety of thought that comes in discussing something that is well studied to one degree, but still barely understood from a human experience perspective. This, despite death being the one universal certainty we all share with one another. For me, death has been a persistent presence throughout my life, as it often is if people choose to acknowledge it as such. For example, a childhood friend was in a traffic accident that killed him instantly, thereby establishing his death as a temporal signpost in my mind that all other deaths would revolve around from a meaning-making perspective. And the years have seen several friends and family members die, accumulating in my mind like open-ended questions or existential events. I think about them often, though some more than most because of where I was in my growth and formation while we were sharing our lives together. My first boxing coach succumbed to cancer, then my second one did. A police coworker and friend took his own life. And more recently, I lost my longtime friend, collaborator, and MMA coach to cancer as well. I can't even do justice in words to the family members who have recently died. So raw is the grief, despite some passage of time. And each loss compounded the previous ones, building a complex architecture of absence that creates intrusive thoughts of grief and loss in every facet of my daily living. I turned to writing to work through these thoughts, initially to process the deaths of my dogs in what I can only now describe as a desperate need to find meaning in mourning. But what emerged was something broader, an admission of my limitations in the face of mortality. I wrote then that I had no insight into death, a statement that remains true despite what one would hope would be wisdom gained with age or even through experience. Not so though. My attempts to eulogize my losses in video instead of writing through a stream of consciousness monologue reminded me once again of the limitations of personal expression. There's something about death that resists being captured no matter the medium. Words always seem to lose their impact in the translation from private emotion to public expression. And once articulated, the loss feels more real, more solid, as though speaking it out loud crystallized it, making it undeniably present without the commensurate therapeutic benefit I was seeking. That first childhood loss haunts me most persistently. I remember my friend's face in the newspaper, the memorial notice shared at school, and most vividly, the empty desk in the classroom. A seat that once held a boy I had laughed and played with was now vacant in a way that I had never experienced before. A type of permanent vacancy that was impossible to come to terms with, though that was precisely the expectation placed on all of us. I was too young to understand death in such categorically specific terms, but old enough to notice how the desk became a focal point of absence. Not that it represented death exactly, but in my mind it came to embody the absence of life, maybe even as a symbol of anti-life more so than death. We all acted as if avoiding the desk might somehow undo the loss and that any sense of permanence for its vacancy was illusory. But of course, it wasn't. I remember moving around the desk as though it held a residual presence, as if the person who once sat there was still nearby, if not in their seat. And the teacher offered no words of substance or sense of propriety in the matter, nor did any of the students likewise affected by the sudden passing of someone who was sitting comfortably in a space shared by us all only days earlier. Come Monday, he was not only no longer in class, but no longer with us in any recognizable or agreed upon form. And we were all managing the scene and the circumstances in our own way, but nobody truly spoke of his death or its effects on us. Our collective silence functioned as inferential license, an unspoken agreement that if we avoided acknowledging his absence, he wouldn't truly be gone. Or perhaps this avoidance was merely our way of managing our own mortality, now that it was made plain to us by proxy. The desk didn't remain empty long. Nobody wanted to sit in it, so eventually it was taken out of the classroom. Much like nature abhorring a vacuum, the class shifted in response, filling in the space that was there before and then swallowing it up as if it had never been there. And what haunted me wasn't just the boy's absence, but how quickly the physical evidence of it disappeared, how readily the world reorganized itself around the void. The fluorescent lights that had once illuminated both his presence and his absence continued their steady, indifferent hum above the reorganized classroom. I remember that to an almost uncomfortable degree, melodramatic though it might seem. To this day, the hum of fluorescence makes me think of an empty desk and the cessation of human life. This early encounter with loss became the template through which I would later attempt to understand all subsequent absences that resulted from death, timely or otherwise. It taught me how the world absorbs and restructures despite individual extinctions taking place, folding in on itself until it can be difficult to remember what was there before. And sadly, this applies to people too. And you and I are people, so keep that in mind. That's mortality salience, the omnipresent understanding of what it means to be mortal. It's the persistent awareness of life's finitude, a quiet undercurrent that seeps into even the most mundane moments. And for some of us, it becomes a constant companion, altering how we perceive every attachment and connection. For others, less so, but they're not exempt from death or its effects. I write from a particular vantage point, male, middle-aged, Western, shaped by loss, policing, combat sports, and parenthood. This perspective does not universalize grief. It only describes how mine has taken shape across the decades. To that end, I've written about death many times, but one significant attempt was after my first boxing coach died of cancer. I tried to capture his essence, but what emerged felt incomplete. The writing contained disjointed fragments that wouldn't coalesce into something whole. Not because of a lack of expressive vocabulary, but because my own understanding was still fragmentary. How do you give form to what defies shaping? How do you articulate a presence that no longer exists outside of your memories? This deficit of understanding only deepened when my police department friend took his own life. And unlike the gradual loss of others to illness, his suicide was sudden, a violent punctuation with no preceding clause that was obvious to anyone on the outside looking at his life. I tried to write through that too, but it was as if each loss expanded the horizon that I couldn't reach. Not just his specific absence, but the accumulating weight of all the deaths throughout my life. Each loss contributed to the erosion and created a slow grinding away of what once felt solid. His absence persisted in the spaces he used to occupy in my memories. The rooms he frequented, the half-finished conversations, the empty chairs at briefings where his distinctive laugh would have cut through all of the squad chatter. It was as though he lingered in the repetition of routine, but was now a presence just outside the framing of those days working together. And once again, I found myself caught between the visceral experience of loss and the inadequate language available to express it. This struggle to work through complex emotions and the feelings they created produced a palimpsest of grief, erasures and tracings of lives lost and sadnesses magnified, like a manuscript written over older text, but never fully erased. And that term is the only one that makes sense to me because it doesn't decorate the loss, but no other metaphor quite captures how each new grief traces itself atop the last one without fully replacing it. Moments that once held significance seem diminished into shapeless narratives, the details fading in the absence of those who had given them scaffolding within my memory. And my writing crumbled against the strength that loss possesses. What remained on the pages were not the losses themselves, but the negative margins around them. Yet it was the only method I knew to give form to the emptiness that kept spiraling outward from within me. Writing became a paradox, a means of anchoring grief while acknowledging its refusal to be contained. The aperture between what we say and what we mean remains expansive and resistant to mapping. It's a liminal space where grief rules all. That tension between the existential event of death and the expression of feelings that arise from it seeped into every moment, even those that had no direct link to the loss. It was the accumulated weight of absence pressing in around me, each a reminder of life's inherent fragility. And perhaps processing grief is just learning to navigate those liminal spaces where what was has been severed from what remains. Not holding on to the lost, but learning to coexist with what's left. This duality shapes our experience of grief, echoing throughout the spaces of absence we carry forward, a constant interplay between what was and what remains. We are simultaneously the ones left behind and the ones who will someday leave others behind, to lose and to be lost. Still, I remain without clarity. And after numerous attempts with text, I turned to video essays to express the same ungraspable feelings, hoping a different medium might bring a new perspective. If writing crumbled, perhaps the interplay of image and sound and voice could trace grief's shape more clearly, or at least differently. The limitations of written language had become too apparent and too constrictive. But in this new form, death remained. Loss wasn't a singular event, but a sequence of event horizons. Each one marked a threshold, and once crossed, nothing could return. Not the presence of the person, nor the possibility of new memories. Only their past remained, sealed beyond reach. The dead are always just one step beyond the present. No new future with them is possible. It was as if each death I was forced to reconcile with redrew the boundary between the living and the missing, expanding the perimeter of what could no longer be felt in physical terms. Just away, remote, and the feelings we have for them, nowhere to go, suspended, unresolved, gathering pressure without a means of release. They lingered, floating at the edge of memory, calling out softly to the spaces that once held those who are gone. And these are not merely memories, but they're dislocated attachments. Feelings that once had clear direction and purpose are now left untethered, but also unable to extinguish due to the resonance they held. Love, anger, respect, frustration. These are attachments without anchors. They're reminders without recipients, connections severed on only one end, but still pulsing with the current on the other. And gradually these unspent attachments crystallize into something sharper, a kind of grief that solidifies yet remains intangible, but it's felt in the persistent ache it leaves behind. Interestingly, the better one becomes at articulating the pain of loss, the more it becomes a visible marker, a reminder that the distance between oneself and the loss is never as vast as it seems. The act of speaking it is also the act of keeping it close. This is why words spoken in the wake of a loss, whether in journals or at eulogies, carry so much weight. They're not closure. They are attempts to hold on to what can no longer be held and to redirect what no longer has a recipient. They are less about resolution and more about wrestling with the realization that eulogizing the dead is a tacit admission that they are indeed gone, existing only in the echoes we choose to keep through repetition and remembrances, rituals and routines. In this way, loss does not merely subtract, it dislocates, creating a miasma of feeling that has nowhere to settle. That empty desk from my childhood, with its stark lesson about how quickly the world reconfigures itself around absence, remains central to how I understand loss. It returns in different forms. And since then, I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of what it means to lose something that once felt like it carried its own momentum forward. That's what life feels like to me. And I don't mean living. I mean life as a force, not a concept, an energy with direction and purpose that continues until it doesn't. And perhaps it's enough to continue bearing witness to these spaces of anti-life, those voids where life once pulsed, now hollowed out, the inverse impressions of what was once present, negative imprints of existence that persist even in the emptiness. If I must accept that these absences still occupy space in my reality, I have to accept that they are transformed, that they're not just voids, but inversions, the residual signature of what once was, still exerting a gravitational pull even in their absence. A tangible absence. Not a supernatural phenomenon, but a persistent impression, a molecular reconfiguration, a vibration that continues without its source. And so we carry these absences within us, learning to live with the paradox of presence in absence. Maybe this is why I continue to circle around death through various forms of expression, not to master it or contain it, but to acknowledge the spaces it creates. Each medium offers its own inadequate but necessary approach to the unapproachable. Words, images, movement, silence, they're all just attempts to honor that which cannot be fully articulated. What began with childhood confusion has evolved through the decades of witnessing other departures. The forms of expression change, but they all serve the same purpose, documenting the persistence of absence, transforming private loss into shared meaning, honoring life even as it withdraws, not to resolve the contradiction of absence, but to respect its enduring complexity. This ongoing engagement with death is not casual or academic on my part. I simply orbit death with obsessive gravity. This fixation isn't philosophical curiosity. It's a compulsion that has consumed decades of thought, shaped my creative works, and influenced nearly every significant decision I have made. Probably even the insignificant ones, if I'm being honest about how embedded this pursuit has been. My chronic return to mortality salience isn't academic. It's the central preoccupation of my consciousness through which all experience is filtered. And despite this relentless scrutiny, an accord remains elusive. But something I understand from that earliest experience is that one day, the desk I inhabit will be empty too. These words will likely outlast me or even the memory of who I was, not as memorials or resolutions, but as qualities of one person's confrontation with the unavoidable. Conceivably, in that continuation, in that transferred momentum from my consciousness to another's through these shared stories, some purpose does reveal itself. I leave these ruminations not as conclusions, but as primary sources for others to consider. And I leave them not as an expert, but as someone who couldn't quite come to terms with the price that life exacts from the living until they join the dead. So may those who find them discover that which has eluded me. Insight that illuminates rather than merely describes, and the quieting of a restless questioning that refuses passive peace.